Welcome. To those just joining, please feel free at any time to share in the chat your name, your organization, where you're calling from, and one way you've helped support your community. We're so happy to see you all today. Thank you for joining the third ReThink Health webinar of our series. My name is Maggie Cook, and I'm a Strategic Partnerships Manager with the Ripple Foundation. As we enter into this shared virtual space alongside one another, we hope you can take a moment to get settled in and grounded. To orient us today, I wanted to briefly share with you where we've been, where we are, and where we're heading. We launched this series in May of this year with an introduction to the vital conditions for health and well-being, and followed with an introduction to shared stewardship in September. If you're new to our audience, welcome. Rest assured that participants do not have to have attended either of those first two sessions in order to fully engage with the material we'll be sharing today. In just a moment, I'll provide you with a quick overview of the terms vital conditions, as well as shared stewardship. Today, we'll be providing an introduction to cultivating belonging and civic muscle. In the new year, we'll continue with an introduction to multi-solving, more on that later. And in March, we'll provide an introduction to how the Three Horizons framework can be used to think about how to nurture systems that create more equitable outcomes in population health and well-being. The intent of the ReThink Health Toolbox webinar series is to help us all embrace our role in transforming the future of health and well-being. It's also a way for us at the Ripple Foundation to share a 101 level introduction to ReThink Health's tools, practices, and frameworks proven to drive deep, meaningful, and long-term change. Today, our primary intention is for each of us, no matter where we are along our journey, for each of us to be able to walk away with a basic understanding of what we mean by cultivating belonging and civic muscle, and to begin to think more broadly about expanding inclusive practices and taking action to shape our communities in ways that foster dignity and well-being. Our speakers will share examples and stories to help bring this to life. And towards the end of the hour, we'll open it up to Q&A. A few practical notes on norms. We encourage you all to share your questions and reflections in the chat as we go. We'll address them as best we can live, and we'll also do so during our Q&A. If you'd like to access closed captions or live transcription, we've enabled those functions, which you can initiate in the bottom ribbon of your screen. You should see the CC or closed caption icon with a little caret next to it, where you can adjust your settings. If you have any questions about that, please feel free to message me in chat. We also encourage you to turn your camera on if possible. Take a look around the room and notice friends or even connections yet to be made. And again, welcome everyone. Lastly, please note that a link to the recording of today's presentation, including the slides and supporting materials, will be emailed to you within about a week's time or so. And now a very, very brief word on what we mean by vital conditions, just as a brief refresher. So vital conditions for health and well-being are the factors and properties of places we all need all of the time to thrive and to reach our full potential. They include necessities like humane housing, access to meaningful work and wealth, and also a sense of belonging and agency or civic muscle. This series is one, but many ways for us to build the movement together towards thriving together, recognizing, of course, that none of us can do this alone. We have shared language around how this can be achieved, and it's through shared stewardship. Stewards are people or organizations who work with others to create conditions that all people need to thrive, beginning with those who are struggling and suffering. Stewardship is not new, nor is it a one-size-fits-all process. Throughout history, stewards have endeavored to extend what is healthy and humane, while working with equal vigor to resist and remove what is toxic and cruel. We'll include in the chat the link to a primer on the essential stewardship practices that focus on 3 patterns: connecting across differences, creating opportunities, and learning and adapting. Today, you'll hear stories of shared stewardship, particularly in context of cultivating belonging and civic muscle. Our presenters are Anna Cregan, Director of Systems Change, and Sierra Bryant, Senior Learning and Impact Associate. We also welcome a special guest today, Frank Naum, who will share a bit about his experience in the work of Civic Commons. And now I'll turn it over to Anna.
Thanks, Maggie. So as Maggie reviewed, we've had a webinar already on the vital conditions and each of the different sections of the pie. But today we're really going to focus in on the pie filling, what I like to call it, belonging and civic muscle. So we define belonging and civic muscle as having a sense of belonging and power to shape a common world. It is at the center because it is both a vital condition in and of itself and also a practical capacity that's necessary for equitable success across all of the other vital conditions. If there's a low level of belonging and civic muscle in a community, it may not matter how much money we throw at different programs and projects. Effectiveness will always depend on the levels of community-wide trust, connection, and contribution. Another helpful definition that I like from our friends at the Othering and Belonging Institute is that it is the idea of the feeling that belonging elicits. It's an element of agency to shape our institutions and communities, and it is a characteristic of organizations, including government, and in particular, democratic ideals and participation. Next slide. You can click through, thank you, yeah. So I'm going to tease these apart a little bit because we lump them together into one title, belonging and civic muscle, but they're 2 different yet complementary ideas. Belonging is a feeling part of a community, embraced for who you are and valued for what you bring. Civic muscle is the power of people in a plural society to work across differences as shared stewards of an equitable, thriving future. They work together to build shared power for well-being and justice across our communities. And when we think about how we are prioritizing and investing in the vital conditions, and in particular in belonging and civic muscle, we can ask ourselves how we are working towards creating legacies that will support generations to come in the future. Next slide. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into kind of the characteristics of belonging and civic muscle and how it looks and shows up in communities. These include social support, civic associations, freedom from stigma, discrimination and oppression, civil rights and human rights, civic agency, collective efficacy, vibrant arts, culture, and spiritual life, equitable access to information, and many different opportunities for civic engagement, such as voting, volunteering, and public work, and all the examples that I saw you all bring in the chat earlier. Next slide. So over the past few years, and in particular as a result of the pandemic, we've seen the visibility of belonging and civic muscle as kind of rising to the surface. The Surgeon General earlier this year put out a report, 85 pages, declaring loneliness as a new public health epidemic and a national public health crisis. The report shows a decline in social connectedness, especially among young people, and outlines significant negative health consequences, including poor mental health, increased risk of heart disease, stroke, dementia, and premature health from all causes. The report states, given the significant health consequences of loneliness and isolation, we must prioritize building social connection the same way we have prioritized other critical public health issues, such as tobacco, obesity, and substance use disorders. Together, we can build a country that's healthier, more resilient, less lonely, and more connected. Other stewards are looking at ways of understanding the state of belonging in America, who feels like they're connected and who doesn't, and ways of measuring how are we building belonging and civic muscle in our communities, such as this belonging barometer. Still others are focused on strengthening civic muscle within communities, such as the All-American City Awards, which recognizes communities that leverage collaboration, inclusiveness, and innovation to address local issues. Belonging and civic muscle is an asset that we have to continue to build and grow, or it will shrink just like our own muscles. We have to get out and exercise them to continue to grow them. Part of our work at Ripple and ReThink Health, along with many other partners across the country, is to build on this visibility and further deepen the value that's being placed on belonging and civic muscle, and help to better understand how we can further invest and prioritize in it at the local, state, and national levels. Our goal is to make belonging and civic muscle more visible, valued, and investable. Today, we're going to continue this work by sharing examples from across the country and hear from Frank, who's deep in building belonging and civic muscle in his own community and more broadly. With that, I'll pass it over to Sierra to share some examples.
Thanks so much, Anna. Hi, everyone. As Maggie said, my name is Sierra Ryan, and I'm a part of the Learning and Impact team here at the Ripple Foundation. I'm based in Delaware and happy to be here with you all today. So Anna just introduced us to what belonging and civic muscle is and why it's important, which I think is a great way to lead us into what cultivating belonging and civic muscle looks like. So how do we put this into action? Today, I'm going to present them as 3 umbrella actions and share examples to build awareness of things we can do in the places we live and work. Next slide, please. So the first is cultivating participation and leadership. This can look like joining alongside others and bringing people together to work interdependently to enact change. In 2021, next slide, please. Sorry, thank you. In 2021, the RISE Coalition partnered with the Migrant Clinicians Network to create an equitable COVID response solution because of worsening disparity in the rates of COVID-19 vaccination and testing rates in communities of color compared to white areas. Having an already close and trust-based relationship with líderes, which means leaders or community champions, RISE and the Migrant Clinicians Network to work with the líderes who themselves were already well valued, well respected, and were deeply trusted in the community that they lived and worked in to bring access to vaccines and across communities to trusted settings that community members already frequent. So this is an act of civic muscle and cultivation of belonging by the líderes to the community and across communities. And it shows how belonging and civic muscle can be created by joining and working with others. Next slide, please. So the next umbrella action that we can do is resist hate and structural oppression, and this can take many shapes. Next slide, please. In 2014, because of disproportionate rates in school suspensions, a parent group in the Eastern Coachella Valley sprung into action by starting a restorative justice campaign to enact change. The issue was that local middle schoolers saw nearly 4% higher suspension rates than the local high schoolers. And on top of that, parents in the community were often left feeling unheard and unvalued by schools in the district. So members of an already established parent leader group led a restorative justice campaign in the district that built leadership development among parents. It spread awareness of restorative justice, and it drove restorative justice practices within the district. So in return, they saw reduced suspension rates among middle and high schoolers. The high schools actually ended up removing their school resource officers by ending a contract with the sheriff's department. And the parents felt a better sense of belonging among the schools by being involved in key decision-making opportunities. So this shows ways that we can use our civic muscle to dismantle a system that was not working for the students or families, and in return, creating a better sense of belonging. Next slide, please. All right, so the last umbrella action we can do is build vibrant and inclusive communities. And this is best told by the next example I'm going to share. So over the last several years, the Seattle Public Housing Authority has worked to turn one of their housing communities into one that is thriving, vibrant, and inclusive. Seattle's first public housing development, Yesler Terrace, was finished in the 1940s, and by 2006, it had aged and neared a state of disrepair. So the Housing Authority worked with several citywide stakeholders, including residents, to reimagine their community. Acknowledging that redevelopment projects are often disruptive, hard, and lead to displacement, the Housing Authority leaned on the arts to redevelop in a way that continued to honor the legacy and minimize displacement. So through a grant with the Prestige Foundation, the new buildings included community art spaces where residents could attend art classes in the lobbies and in empty apartment units, and also have their art displayed around the housing community and even at the Seattle Museum of Art. And as they described it, it helped them to shift the narrative about who lives in public housing developments. So this art program was far less about the product of art, and it was actually more about relationship building and creating experiences for residents that gave them space to tell us their story about what community means to them, their history, and what they value. So in the words of one of the housing authority staff, watching the program has fundamentally changed my idea about what art can be in a community. I thought we'd get some nice art out of it, but this has been entirely different than I expected. We've seen incredible gains in understanding of why and how resident voice is essential to development practices. So this is an example of how building vibrant and inclusive communities can be done by way of art and can help to cultivate belonging in communities. So I'm inspired by all of these stories, and I'm beginning to see inspiration for things that I can be doing in my small Delaware community that I was born, raised, and still live in. As you can see, these very real and tangible examples of cultivating belonging civic muscle through cultivating participation and leadership, dismantling oppression and resisting the rise of hate, and building vibrant and inclusive communities are things being done all around us and things that I'm sure we're all doing in this very room and can continue to do to contribute to a community where all of its residents are able to thrive. So now I'll turn it over to Frank Nam. We Belong Here project director from Civic Commons. Frank is someone that I had the pleasure to meet recently, but has been a longtime friend of the Ripple Foundation and has also been a partner to us and has been an inspiration to learning about belonging. And speaking of Seattle, he just so happens to be a Seattle resident. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Frank.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sierra. Hi, everyone. I'm wearing my Seattle Sonics hat on purpose. And what a great transition to talk about Yester Housing, someplace I've driven past many, many times before they created the new housing. There's a lot of fear in Seattle when that housing was raised and put down that residents would be displaced. But, you know, the work that SHA and the community has done has been just phenomenal. Beautiful housing in like prime location in real estate wise in Seattle, and with residents' feedback and co-participation, co-creation. So I'm a big fan. So I want to use, you know, the Marshall Gans framework of public narrative to just kind of frame my part of today's conversation. So I'm going to talk about myself, you know, story of self. I'm going to talk about Civic Commons, the background, and talk about what we're working on. And if we do have time in this section, we'll pause for questions, but if not, we'll definitely take questions at the end. So next slide, please. All right, so just really quickly, a little bit about myself. I was born in Seoul, but grew up in the New York City area and moved to Seattle after graduating college. And as you can tell, I've had a really wide array of sectors that I've worked in. So I started my career at Microsoft and working with startups in the 1990s, early 2000s. And that wasn't really for me. You know, that was something that more I did because it paid well, it was fun. But in 2003, I had a kind of a tough year and a lot of things went wrong. But that switched me over to thinking about, you know, what kind of impact do I want to have on the world? And that's when I switched to a almost, you know, 11-year, 12-year career in nonprofit. So I worked for a local nonprofit in Seattle called Treehouse, where I created a mentoring program for foster youth that want to go on to post-secondary endeavors. And then I spent about 6 years at City Year, which is a national AmeriCorps program. And I was the managing director of admissions. So my job was to help recruit about 3,300 AmeriCorps volunteers every year across 28 cities. And so that was a lot of fun. That was really great getting a chance to work in, oh, nice. I see someone played Ultimate in the chat. And so in 2013, I joined Leadership Tomorrow, which is a regional leadership program in the Seattle area. They bring in folks from private sector, public sector, and the nonprofit sector, about 80 people each year, and they go through our leadership program, very similar to Vital Conditions in terms of learning about how arts is related to economy, is related to education, is related to basic needs. And then in Civic, I actually worked for the city of Seattle for about 3 years in the Department of Neighborhoods, and then I moved to Civic Commons. And yes, I was an ultimate Frisbee coach, player and coach. I've actually coached the Korean national team, but that's a totally different story. We don't need to go into that. So next slide, please. All right, so the story of us. It was mentioned earlier that I have a long and deep foundation and connection with Ripple and ReThink Health. In fact, ReThink Health, King County, Gates Foundation, Seattle Foundation, Healthier Here, Communities of Opportunity, these were all organizations that were part of a grand collective, or geographic collective that was working with ReThink Health. And the origins of Civic Commons actually stems from there. These leaders from across sectors really learn more about the power of civic muscle, the power of belonging, and it really hit home that this is not just about health outcomes, but it's just about all outcomes. And how can we actually bring that into the region in a powerful way, in a way that hasn't been done? So Civic Commons, I'll talk about kind of our belonging moonshot, what we're trying to do, what our pieces are, the start of our belonging gatherings, the use of podcasts for narrative shift, and then what we've created called the Greater Seattle Compact for Belonging. So let's start with the belonging moonshot. Next slide. So our belonging moonshot, when I use that as the JFK speech about the race to space, how do we actually change and get to transformational outcomes, right? I think that's what all of us want. And so when I think about that, I really think about, we have three basic elements. One, if you want to go someplace, you really need to know navigation wise, like where are you headed? And so we have something called a scorecard for shared prosperity. And it measures change towards collective action across 5 dimensions, individual, households, communities, economy, democracy. And then across those 5 dimensions, there are 33 indicators. And as much as possible, we try to disaggregate by race and ethnicity. And so this kind of tells the county and the region how we're doing. Are we on the right track? Are we heading in the right direction? So that's kind of our GPS, our navigation. Now, if you want to get to the moon, you need a vehicle. And probably, I think JFK famously said, like, we need new alloys and new materials that haven't even been designed yet. And that vehicle for us is network weaving. And this fits so much in line with everything that Ripple is doing and ReThink Health is doing. So we want a cross-sector table. We're issue agnostic. We're not here to say, like, hey, let's work on this particular issue and lead the charge, but we want to work with partners and change the process, right? We're process forward and not issue forward. But, we want to pick up where we see there's a need. So democracy, we did a phase 1. And so we brought in people from the public, private, nonprofit sectors who are all working on democracy in certain ways. And we brought them together and we actually worked with Google, and we saw that a bottleneck was a lot of communities that didn't have English as a first language were stuck with the voter guideline pamphlet, which was not in all languages. And we worked with Google to get that translated across all languages to communities. And so that was just one piece of vehicle network weaving. And then we have something called the Black Home Initiative, and this is actually a huge project. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this. The goal of the Black Home Initiative is to create 1,500 new low and moderate income Black households to own a home in South Seattle, South King County, and North Pierce County in the next 5 years. And this is an 80 group partnership between local banks, national banks, for private developers, public developers, county, city, state, a lot of different organizations are across the board, lenders, foundations, builders, developers, to create this, what are the bottlenecks? How are home buyers not being able to access funds? What are some of the laws that are, regressive? And that's something that we are in year 2 of. And that is a huge network weaving example that we're utilizing these practices. So we have our GPS, we know where we're headed, we have our vehicle, and usually the reason that we don't ever get to where we want to go, in my opinion, in our opinion, is belonging, or the lack of belonging, and that's our fuel. The idea of how do we shift the narrative from scarcity to surplus? How do we, create social capital between people? And how do we take relationships before transactions? And so all those three things, our theory of change is that if we can do these three things, we can actually get to transformational outcomes. And then we don't even need to exist anymore. Next slide, please. So in 2020, right before coronavirus happened, we decided to bring together a group of about 100 people to have our inaugural belonging gathering. And this is definitely taken off of the examples that the Othering and Belonging Institute has run for many years. And instead of, it feels really weird to say like, hey, we're going to have a belonging gathering and we're going to specifically invite all 100 people, because that feels like you're excluding folks. So what we did was actually invited 20 people, and we asked all of them to invite 4 people that they knew. And so it was a concentric circle of invitees. It's not just, we decide what the guest list is. We just decide a portion of it, and then the rest of the guests decide who to bring. If you go to the next slide, that'd be great. So we had 3 objectives in the inaugural belonging gathering. And that was 1, to connect across sectors, identities, and affiliations. 2, weave our values, interests, and narratives. And lastly, to create a new compact to promote collective action. And we were able to achieve 2 of those objectives during that time, and we were not able to reach the third, but we did reach it later. So I'll explain in a second. So that first objective, I worked with brain developers, neuropsychologists, community organizers, storytellers. And what we thought, we wanted to make sure we try to nourish a safe space as possible. So we had community agreements ahead of time, would let people know what the agenda is, what the expectations were. And we wanted to foster unexpected connections. Folks who didn't know each other, folks who have never been in the same room together from different sectors and lived experiences. And through storytelling, we wanted to willingly build brave bridges between folks. So that was our first objective. The second one, and this is a 2-day event, all day. So it's a lot to ask people, but it was something that we thought was important enough, and people came out. We want to explore our differences and similarities, make space for individual narratives, kind of using that Marshall Gans framework around public narrative, and then take those individual stories and connect them into a living tapestry. And lastly, we wanted to distill multifaceted narratives. So all these stories that we built, we want to distill that into very specific values, practices, and actions, and then start committing to commit to future work together. Next slide, please. So after that gathering, we had so much momentum, so much energy. We were so excited about this work. And then the coronavirus descended upon us. And for 6 months, couldn't go out, couldn't meet with people, couldn't hold events, and 6 months and longer. And so during that time, maybe in the spring of that year, we decided to create a podcast. We knew nothing about podcasting. We've never tried it before, but it was just an idea that we need to get to the public and we need to shift narrative. And this is probably the only way to do it at that time. So next slide, please. So the We Belong Here podcast is really, we have 3 specific questions that we ask all guests, but basically what happens is we try to bring in guests from different sectors, be it, public, private, philanthropic, nonprofit, community organizers, etc., around a theme like education or public space. Or we had one great podcast during Veterans Day where we talked to 3 combat veterans who worked in nonprofit, government, and foundations. And what we do is we try to take people from different backgrounds and then we try to weave them together. So we do an origin story question to start, since storytelling is at the core of our work. So we ask our guests to tell us who they are and what shaped them. How do they become who they are? What events, people, places shape them? And then we tie in belonging. We ask them about, in their educational history, how did they feel like they belonged or they didn't? And how did that impact them? Or how does that impact their work? And then we always save space to amplify, augment, and accelerate by asking guests to plug anything that they're working on between their world of work, their side hustle, or passion project. And this is something that we've just been doing over the last few years. And it's just a great way to bring folks in and have some conversations and start building some bridges. Next slide. And so the big thing that we're trying to do and accomplish is create this compact for belonging. And definitely if you have seen it before, the New Social Compact, you can go to newsocialcompact.org. You can take a look at something that the Othering and Belonging Institute and partners in California have put together. But we wanted to create something that was Pacific Northwest, Greater Seattle specific. And so the Belonging Gathering, that first one, became virtual gatherings afterwards. And so every year we did virtual gatherings, and eventually, utilizing storytelling, we're able to distill what the values that people really cared about, and then what were the practices that created belonging, and then what was the call to action. So next slide, please. So, when you create a compact for people, you have to create it with communities. You have to co-create it, co-design it. And so these values, practices, call to actions were not our own, but community created. So the values that we landed upon, and I love everywhere we landed upon, but belonging was obviously a big value, love and justice. And I love what Cornel West says about justice. He says justice is what love looks like in public. And I think that's incredibly true. Love and justice are actually quite similar. And I think belonging is the bridge between them. Practices, story sharing and storytelling is a huge practice that we realize that until you know someone and you can share your story, how do you feel like you belong unless people know who you are and you can talk about yourself in your full identity? And then also advocacy. Fits in so much great with Ripple's, vital conditions. The idea of you have to advocate for yourself, but also for others. That's a huge part of belonging because you're putting skin in the game. You're fighting for other people's causes. You're working towards justice. And then building community in all aspects, be it in your neighborhood, be in your parks, be in your schools, be in your office. And the one that surprised me the most was the fourth one, personal growth. Personal growth is this idea that, there's a great clip that Brene Brown is saying recently, is hitting my social media a lot, where she talks about fitting in is the opposite of belonging. Because when you fit in, you're changing or hiding parts of yourself to feel like you belong. But that's not true belonging because you're not entering that space as fully who you are. And personal growth, even at the cellular somatic level, is if you don't know who you are and how you belong to yourself, how can you fit with others? Right? How do you know if you're fitting in or not, or if you're being authentic? And I think that's the practice that I really love the most and probably have the most personal journey to keep growing in. And then lastly was the call to action. We've created toolkits, social media toolkits, different types of toolkits around, creating belonging at home, with your family, with your community, with your office. We've asked people to sign on, and we started a belonging ambassador program to really empower folks to share this messaging, share the practices and values across the region. And next slide. I think we might be close to end. Yep. Can someone tell me, I'm so bad at keeping track of time when I present. So if we have time for questions now, great. If we don't, we can save them towards the end.
Yeah, I think now would be a great time. We could probably take about 3 or 4 minutes to just kind of open it up, and maybe Frank, there was one particular question in the chat directed at you, and then maybe we could also suggest everyone share a little bit about their own sense of belonging. But Starlene asked in the chat, Frank, what models or framework did you use to develop your moonshot?
Yeah, the models and frameworks we use in terms of thinking about the scorecard, thinking about network weaving, and thinking about the idea of belonging. The belonging one, which is obviously my area of expertise in terms of the work we do at Civic Commons, is a lot comes from the work that Ripple and ReThink Health has done, like I said earlier, but also everything that John A. Powell and the Othering and Belonging Initiative talks about, ideas around targeted universalism, right? That's a huge framework for us. It's not, equity is the goal, but the way we get there is through belonging and targeted universalism. We're not just trying to change the gap between people that have privilege and access and people that don't, but we actually want to create the ceiling above for everyone, right? How do we float the boat for everybody, but knowing that we have to target our resources towards those who are farthest away? So when you talk about um, equity in some ways, people get to this idea that scarcity mindset, like, okay, if I have, that means I have to give away things to like make it equitable, and that's not the idea. The idea is that pie can grow for everyone, and if you don't think that way, then it creates a lot of scarcity mindset. So that's a huge one. The idea of building bridges there, is a huge part of our work in terms of how do we get people from different places who don't interact, even in very narrow lanes, like nonprofits that all work on housing, they don't talk to each other. Why is that? Because there's a lot of like scarcity mindset around like trying to get the same funders, trying to get the same funding, and so how do we start letting go some of these walls that we built up to create more connective tissue around organizations that are working towards the same cause? So those are two models that we've used.
Okay.
Oh, where can we see these tools? You can go to, I'll put that in the chat. This is our compact, and there's a toolkit there. So 1 second.
Thank you. And thanks, and keep the questions coming. We're going to have at least 15 minutes at the end of the call to just open it up in plenary, share stories, ask more questions. Let's continue really briefly towards our closing. A lot of people will, including myself, sometimes we wonder, like, okay, I've heard all of these inspiring stories, so thinking to ourselves, like, what's next? Though today we only have an hour together, and these sessions are designed to provide that sort of just introductory level overview, we encourage all of us to dive deeper into the what and the how. You can find an excellent offering of curated resources that a lot of us on the line, and including ReThink Health, we've contributed to on the Thriving Together website. The vital conditions, including belonging and civic muscle, are measurable. Frank spoke earlier about navigation scorecard, and that it included 33 indicators. So to help demystify how to measure belonging and civic muscle, you can explore the resources like what Community Commons has pulled together too. We'll share that link in the chat. And then before we move on to the Q&A portion of our time together, we hope you'll take a few minutes to fill out a brief survey on today's webinar. Your feedback is very valuable to us and will help us improve future offerings. In order to diffuse stewardship across the country and beyond, for it to really take hold as a way to drive transformational change, we must share stories of stewardship in action for others to see, learn from, and be inspired by. We've heard a lot of great ones today, and we know that there are many, many more. We invite you to share those stories with us, and we'll help get them out through our outlets that are dedicated to sharing stories of stewards. The Unsung Stewards podcast, the Stewards Rising campaign, both of which see and celebrate the diverse efforts of stewards. Reach out to Ripple's Deputy Director of Communications, Layla Hussein, to share your story. And as mentioned earlier, our next webinar will take place on January 25th, and the topic will be an introduction to multi-solving. In the simplest terms, multi-solving is the practice of identifying and advocating for policies and investments that can solve multiple problems often across sectors. So please keep a lookout in your email for the coming Save the Date. You can also register today, and we hope you'll join us. Lastly, just as a reminder, the resources from today's webinar, including the slides and a recording of today's session, will be emailed to those who registered and also will be uploaded to our website. I just wanted to take a moment once again to thank our speakers today, Anna Cregan, Sierra Bryant, and Frank Nam. Really, really appreciate all of the thought and time and energy that you put together, pulling together these amazing stories and examples for us to all sort of think about for time to come. And while y'all are filling out your evaluation surveys, feel free to unmute yourselves, share your observations and reactions or questions. I know one thing Frank and Anna and Sierra and I were talking about before this call was Frank had posed this wonderful question around, when's the last time you really felt a strong sense of belonging, and why was that? What created that? What were the circumstances? Let's just kind of open it up. I'm going to stop sharing the slides and open it up so we can all see each other. And feel free to come off mute if you'd like to. Did anyone have any aha moments you feel like sharing, or any questions you have today?
We'd also just love to hear how you all are doing this. We know you are doing the work. Maybe you don't call it this, but how are you doing this work in your communities?
I wanted to say that this was a great opportunity to sort of think about the heart and the measurability of it. There's a lot of times when we get really hung up in measuring and, how do you know? And I think a lot of times what is meaningful is not measurable, and sometimes what is measurable is not particularly meaningful. But I thought that Frank did a really nice job of sort of showing both of those, because it's the philosophy that informed it, but at the same time, there are ways in which we know when we're making progress. And I thought that was really excellent.
I just want to say to Frank, I absolutely loved your idea about how you invited 20 people and asked them to invite another 4. Like, to me, that's just like such an aha moment, because so many things, so many catalysts happen when there's that diversity and, just that opportunity of really being inclusive. And I just adore that idea, and I'm going to try and steal it in some way, somehow. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing we ask people is, because we asked a group of 20 that are very different from different lived backgrounds and sectors, and we asked them to pick people that are either from a similar lived background or a similar sector, or both, but didn't want to create too many containers around it. And it was just great that so many people I've never met before across the region came out, and it was really a lot of fun. So definitely recommend that style of invitation.
Maggie, there's a question in the chat from Lisa, and I don't know if she's willing to come off mute. I want to make sure we can maybe try to get a response or a thought, but I'm not sure I'm clear which tool she's referring to.
This is Lisa. So one of the things is I work with hospital systems, local nonprofits, and government agencies to use many different tools, trying to get them to shift to using vital conditions as their framework for what they're doing. And so one of the complications in doing that is, one, explaining the tool as it links to whatever they're doing. The tool that you guys listed as a scorecard for shared prosperity. And I'm curious why use that for belonging versus use it for the economic condition or whatever.
So I think that's the idea of the scorecard for shared prosperity, and those statistics are all publicly generated and accessible statistics that we're putting in one place. And a lot of people say, it is definitely a tool around measurement and data, but we're not, focusing on the data. Let me say it like this: we don't focus so much on the numbers as in terms of the narrative that the numbers tell. And we use indicators like green and red arrows to say, like, because a lot of times people will say, like, the King County region, especially before COVID, was in terms of household income, wealth generation, economic progress, was rising in terms of general indicators. But if you actually disaggregate the data, you see that especially home ownership is going down for people of color, especially Black folks. And so that's part of the reasoning why BHI came to be, because we wanted to create a multi-partnership collective to work towards that. And so the scorecard is it just kind of gives us an idea of how the region's doing, and it's publicly available, and it's the idea is not just for us, but we want our partners to utilize it, to take a look at it, to use it as a talisman, as a thing that they can say, hey, this is something that we need to change and we can work on, and then rally people together to work on that.
Thank you, Frank. I see Janice has her hand up. We also have a question in the chat that Starlene asked before that I'd like to get to after this, but Janice, come on and what's on your mind?
Can you hear me okay?
We can. Okay.
I want to respond as someone who can boast of the lived experience, why I don't want to use the word willingness, but why the necessity of sharing economic opportunities is a necessity. Because for too long, too often, okay, how do I say white people and not offend anyone? But, white people go into Black communities, savior of the world kind of thing. And you walk in, you waltz out, and you leave the same poor people. You leave people who are living disparities. You leave people who have the history of trauma that is rarely dealt with in our health delivery system, rarely handled through public health and prevention. So I think for some people, that to have an opportunity to see and realize economic advantages, I personally see that as a positive way to help people connect better to their own communities. And I apologize, my gardener is outside, so I'm going to go on mute.
Thank you, Janice. I see a lot of nods in complete agreement. Starlene asked a question, and I think, Starlene, you're still on the line. If so, feel free to come on off mute if you'd like to ask the question that you posed a few minutes ago about indicators and measures.
Oh, sure. So I was curious about when you were developing your indicators or your measures for success, what does it look like? So I was wondering if there were any specific tools or frameworks that you utilized to begin that process. of being able to, co-create amongst different people on your team and within community, right? To create that cross-pollination and cross collaborative effort in really defining and designing what success looks like.
Is that question directed at me? Just want to.
Yes, Frank. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay. Yeah. Want to make sure.
Yep.
Well, it depends on the project, right? And so something like Black Home Initiative has a very specific indicator, which is, can we create new households, right? Can we actually create more homes being bought, and that, the power of generational wealth is actually started in communities. That's something that's very specific. But here's the thing with like relationships. Building relationships and measuring them are incredibly tough. There's a great Simon Sinek TED talk where he talks about like asking the interviewer, like, sorry, I'm gonna try to get this quickly. Like, how do you know you love your wife? How can you measure it? Tell me the number that you love your wife out of 100, right? And he's like, it's an impossible question, right? How do you measure love? But what you do is love is sustained over many times and many actions, and doing this over across, right? If you work out for 3 hours in one day and you step on a scale and you haven't lost any weight, is that not working? And so it's hard to measure, even within the 5 years that we've been together. It's hard to measure it, but something that we're working on is a framework for cities, and by cities I don't mean government, but actually communities, to be a city of belonging or community of belonging, is to start utilizing surveys. The belonging barometer questions are great, and then utilizing surveys actually to measure, questions as simple as, do you have a neighbor do you have a neighbor that you can go to in time of need, right? So like we can actually start collecting some of that data and sharing it, and then seeing it year to year, how are we doing in that way? There's also different tools you can use, like Kumu, I think it's called Kumu, some app, where you can actually measure relationships between people, like how thick they are, who are the nodes, what are the connection points. But yeah, so it depends on the project. There are obviously things that we're trying to build, but in terms of relationship building, it's I would not say we've mastered it, but there is definitely something that we think about a lot. I posed that to Othering and Belonging Institute, and they're like, that's a team of university researchers, and they're like, yeah, we're still thinking about this. And so, as soon as we have news, I'm happy to share it with folks. And if people have examples that they've used, I always want to learn from others.
Frank, where can we see some of the questions or instruments you have used? Is that available largely? Or?
Yeah, you can go to our general website. I'll put both our general website, the We Belong Here website. I think I actually posted up there already, and then the Black Home Initiative website. So I'll put all those three up on the
and also, could you tell us a little bit about what some of the challenges were? What were some of the difficulties? Every journey always involves some difficulties, right? And we can learn from those as well.
No, it's been completely easy, Nazir. I don't know what you're talking about. There has been no issues, no problems. Super. No. If you have to, I don't want to get all like Lord of the Rings, but if you had one enemy of belonging, obviously scarcity mindset is one, but another one is time, right? I can talk all I want about scarcity mindset, but time is a scarcity thing. You can't create more time. I mean, you can cut your schedule up a little bit. People don't create enough time in their schedules to actually do this work. That is my big thing. So incredibly effective leaders that need to know this work and work on this and work with others don't have time in their schedules, because hyper productivity, the idea that you need to be busy, but then you also have family, things outside of work that you're focusing on. But if you don't actually take the time and start carving stuff out of your schedule to say like, hey, this 10 hours a week, I'm going to just work on projects that are not my own domain, or I'm going to work with collaborators, or I'm going to ask questions, or I'm going to do information interviews, or I'm going to be part of my community building team, whatever that is. Like if we don't set aside time. And so getting people to actually give up time to do things has been one of the toughest things for me, because people are just over productive, over scheduled. And if we don't create time, then how do we actually create relationships?
And speaking of time, we have about 2 minutes left.
Good transition.
Yeah, right. Good segue. I see Nicola has had his hand raised for a while. I hope that I pronounced that correctly. Do you want to come off mute?
Yes, Maggie, thank you very much for giving me the floor in the last minutes of the meeting. Actually, my questions were pertaining also to the metrics and developing of KPIs in terms of community development, the dimensions that you've considered, taking also time to elaborate the values which are relevant for the community. I feel all of this is relevant, and I was wondering if there might be some written reports already which sum up some of the processes that you've had in articulating some of these dimensions which are important for community well-being. This is for Frank, and I'd like also to thank everyone for organizing this. It was very, very helpful and insightful, and I'd like to say hi to everyone from Amsterdam.
Nice. So scorecard is not my realm of expertise or ownership, but in terms of written reports, I'll have to get back to you. I'll put my email in the chat, and let's maybe follow up offline. Maybe I can connect you with someone from our team that works on that a little bit more than I do. But yeah, and then we can talk about anything else that you asked me to and follow up there, because I want to be aware of the time. Yeah, but yeah, let me send that to you, and we can touch base offline. Yeah.
Well, I can't thank you all enough for being here. Thanks again, Anna, Sierra, Frank, and all of the other people here who have helped behind the scenes. These webinars are a real labor of love, and we're so happy to see all of you here today. Hope to see you again in January, and until then, wishing you a healthy couple of months, and please stay in touch. Please fill out the evaluation survey. And if you're not already on our mailing list, go ahead and sign up for that so you make sure to receive all of news about our upcoming events and speakers. And with that, send you off with well wishes for a great rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.